So well, let me get behind this. I'm going to talk about this. So, well, thanks so much, Lauren, and thanks so much for giving me some time to share these ideas. I mean, I'm going to go pretty quickly right now because what's much more interesting is the actual thinking from peasant movements around the world. But I do want to do three things. First of all, I want to give you some tools to think around the question of what the food system is. I know that there's been some work on systemic thinking. And I just want to consolidate that. The next thing is I actually want to get into what the Green Revolution was. And then finally, I want to sort of thread us through what it is that we can do to unlearn some of the thinking that still squats in the back of our minds when we think about the food system today. So let's sort of kick in. So what exactly is the food system? What I want to do is suggest a way of answering this question that's a little orthogonal to the ways that you perhaps might be used to. And I just want you to look at this statement. When jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. When jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. Now, this is something I'm hoping we probably wouldn't agree to. But it was a question that was posed as part of something called the World Values Survey just over a decade ago, and it was asked in a number of different countries. And they surveyed the number of people who agreed with this. In Sweden, 2% of people agreed. In the United States, 5.7%. In India, 52% agreed that if jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. And in Egypt, 99.6% of people who were asked said, if jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. Now, I mean, at some level, this is appalling. And at some level, this is entirely economically rational. I mean, imagine that you live in a very patriarchal economy, not just the one that we're living in now, but even more patriarchal. And imagine that in this economy, jobs are scarce and man jobs just earn more than women jobs. If everybody's going hungry in the household and you only had a crack at one job, you would want that to be the high-paying job. If it's a man's job, you don't like patriarchy, but you don't like going hungry even worse. So you say, yes, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women because you want more money in your household. But what if we could control for income? If we could take the income question out of the equation, we could ask a much more interesting question, which is, why, if we take income out of the equation, are some societies more sexist than others? And there are a lot of reasons why societies might be sexist. One reason might be the presence or absence of oil. Now, I mean, think about your archetypical sexist society. If that society has a resource curse, if it has a lot of oil or diamonds or some lithium, whatever it is, you might imagine that this society was more sexist because men were in control of it, and somehow that made patriarchy worse. You might think that religion is something that drives the attitudes around sexism. You might think, it's just the representation of women's bodies in the mainstream media. Or you might think, I don't know, that the presence or absence of plows has something to do with patriarchy. And in fact, you would be right. There's a fantastic paper. You just see the title of this, on the origins of gender roles, women and the plow. This was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is the gold standard economic journal. And what they did was look over 200 years of data, took out the income element and said, look, we noticed that if you control for income, the societies that are most sexist are the ones that have a history of using plows. So this is the question I want to help us think through is, well, how does the food system have anything to do with patriarchy? And the way I want to answer it is by guiding you through this picture. This is a portrait by Thomas Gainsborough. It hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. And if you read this picture correctly, you will understand everything that you need to know about the modern food system. So let's begin. I mean, you've got this sort of bucolic scene. It looks fairly standard, but actually it's weird. Look first at Mr. Andrews, and what do you see? Well, I mean, at first blush, it's just a guy staring at you with a gun and a dog looking up at him. But actually, this guy is incredibly casually dressed, right? Look at him. He's wearing clothes, but only one button is done up. In the 1750s, in the world of portraiture, this is like wearing a T-shirt to having your portrait done. It's very casual. And it speaks of an arrogance of someone who is richer than you are and doesn't care what you think of him. And And he was rich in part because he'd married well, but also because he was a cutting edge farmer using bleeding edge technology. He published in the leading agronomy journals of the time. And he was a man who was in charge of this kind of land. This is where the plow comes into our story. He understood that if you wanted to maximize the amount of money coming out of your land, you would use the latest available technology, and the plow was part of that. Now, you'll notice that in order to have a plow, you also need men to push that plow. You need labor in one way or another, but the people doing the work are not in this picture. And that's also part of the story. The invisibilization of the people doing the work is part of the portrait. It's part of the modern food system. And this is cutting edge technology. This man, Mr. Andrews, knew about how to farm. He'd studied in the right kinds of journals, read the right kind of knowledge. He'd used a seed drill to put the seeds in the ground, a seed drill invented by Jethro Tull. For those of you old enough to know what that is. This is, how the plow really stands for the modern food system. The plow is a way of hiding labor and maximizing output, not so that people get fed, but because these sheaves of wheat represent money. You're growing food not to feed people, but for money. So the second part of the story is about gender. Now, back here in this picture, you see an area that once upon a time used to be the commons. In the system that existed before capitalism, it's called feudalism. Before capitalism, in feudalism, women peasants didn't have a great life. No one's pretending that women and men were equal, but women were able to have extra income by driving cattle across the common land. And they were able to make money by selling milk and by dairying. And what happened under the advent of modern agriculture was that this common land that was shared and managed very well by everybody became enclosed. And this enclosure of the commons meant that from the point of modern agriculture's arrival, women started earning systematically less than men. So this is how plows and gender go together, is that when you bring the plow in, you bring a model of farming in that keeps women and their knowledge out of the picture. And from that point onward, we see a divergence in women and men's wage rates. And so the plow is associated with higher degrees of sexism. And you can see that just by looking at the woman in the picture. This is Mrs. Andrews. Her dad owned all of this. He was a silver trader. What do you notice about her? She's out in the open, but wearing clothes that are the finest money can buy. And if you look right in the middle, you'll see an unfinished part of the canvas. And here was meant to be the area where a young son was going to be painted in. And in the end, she didn't have one. And so the canvas was bare. And this picture, all in all, shows us a story about modern farming. It shows a sort of the history of farming. It shows what feudalism has enclosed. And many commentators have looked at this picture and said, well, look, actually, Mrs. Andrews is as bound, as enclosed, and as owned as the land around her. And this is how modern food systems, which are the relationships of power that make some things normal and other things abnormal, this is how the modern food system makes sexism normal. Here in the United States, 97% of the land of farmers are men, and it's predominantly a male occupation. But we can and we should talk about the sort of gender variations elsewhere in the world. But I want to move into thinking about how this picture that you've seen actually is part of a long history. It's not just that the Green Revolution began in the 1940s, although that's when we date it from. The idea of the Green Revolution is something that actually, is a lot longer and a lot older. And when we think of the Green Revolution, we often think of it in a shorthand of, well, yeah, it was that bit where all of a sudden lots more food was produced in the third world. If you want a quote that sort of defines that, here's one from the New Yorker a few years back, where Michael Spector, was talking about the Green Revolution. He said, look, the Green Revolution was fantastic because between 1965 and 1972, India's wheat production doubled. And you would think, well, this is fantastic. Is that true? And you would check the data and you would say, yes, it is true. Look at that. This is India's wheat production from 1961 to 1980, and you can see that from 65 to 72, it definitely goes up by double. This is fantastic. But then you have to ask, well, what's driving that? Was it just the miracle of Norman Borlaug and his magic seeds? Well, actually, if you look at the the economics behind it, one of the ways that you can get people to grow things is by increasing the price. And the data that's available only goes back to 1966. But well, yeah, the price doesn't seem to be doing too much. You know, there isn't a huge spike in the price that's sustained from, like, you know, 1965 to 1972. So there's something else going on here. And what's going on is American power. What I'm showing in this graph here is, in gray, you see the price for as much data as available at the Food and Agriculture Organization. But before 1966, we can also see that there's quite a lot of imported grain. In fact, so much that Indian farmers found that they couldn't compete. This grain was grain that was coming from the United States as part of its PL 480 program. So in the Global South, a lot of people know PL 480 by name. In America, people haven't really heard of it. But it was the Cold War program to make sure that places that the US was worried about would be given food as long as they fought communism. Indians will remember that actually year to year, Lyndon B. Johnson would check to make sure that India hadn't said anything offensive and would license and allow grain shipments only if India had behaved itself. And this is quite important. I want to just give you the screen. I mean, the geopolitics of the early 1960s meant that actually the reason Indian farmers weren't growing wheat was not because they were incompetent or incapable or they lacked magic seeds. It was because the US was providing so much grain for free that the Indian farmers stopped trying, and Indian production failed to rise fast enough to meet increasing domestic demand. So that's really important because that helps uncover actually the story of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is told to us today as the magic agricultural technology that was fertilizers and pesticides and irrigation. But actually, when the US tried to push the Green Revolution, push these seeds, Indian farmers weren't having any of it. And what Indian farmers needed most of all to adopt this technology wasn't the technology itself, it was subsidies. This is often airbrushed out of our history and our memory of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was explicitly intended to stop land reform from happening and to make existing farmers adopt this technology so that the Americans could sell their grain to the USSR, which is what happened under the Cold War, and instead keep the relations of production the same. Now, you may say, well, look, Raj, you're talking a lot of political nonsense, and I don't care. So what if the Green Revolution was political? We don't care. India's grain production went up by, it doubled between 1965 and 72. That's the thing that matters. And so, Norman Borlaug won his prize for feeding the world. Well, let's look at the data. If you look at India's food supply from 1961 to 1980, show me where the Green Revolution is here. I mean, yeah, you see an uptick from 65 to 69 to 70. But then when the Green Revolution was happening, there's still no mechanism for making sure that the more food ends up in the bellies of the hungry. I think this is quite important, that the Green Revolution was intended to keep urban populations from going communist and to stop land reform from peasant movements, demands from land reform being met. And this is why I think we need to understand, well, look, why was it called the Green Revolution? Was it called the Green Revolution because it made people rich? Was it called the Green Revolution because it was an environmental improvement, or because it resulted in a lot more green fields, or because it emphasized hemp production? Is that why it was called the Green Revolution? Or was it called the Green Revolution because it wasn't red or white? Well, the last answer is because it wasn't red or white. This is where the term the Green Revolution was coined by the man who was administrator of what we used to call a USAID. And what he said was, he was talking about subsidies this is a quote from the US Senate hearings. He was talking about subsidies and inducements to get farmers to use these crops. And he says, look, these and other developments in the field of agriculture contain the makings of a new revolution. It is not a violent red revolution like that of the Soviets. It's not a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. I call it the Green Revolution. So remember that when we're talking about the Green Revolution, we're not talking about the seeds. Because China had improved agriculture. We're talking about a way of imposing these seeds that keeps relationships of power intact, that doesn't allow for land reform, that doesn't allow for a working class in urban areas to insist on their rights and their power. So let me end here by just asking, well, look, if if the Green Revolution was actually a series of interventions about seeds, about subsidies, about preventing the status quo from changing, and to some extent, it was also about population control. You saw that quote earlier on about Norman Borlaug. In India, forced sterilizations was also part of the Green Revolution in order to stop, the fecund third world from breeding in the way that Norman Borlaug was talking about. Well, if that was the thinking behind the Green Revolution in the first place, what's the opposite of that? Well, I mean, in part, we need to start bringing the idea of power in. Because food, the idea of the Green Revolution is we'll produce food and then we'll distribute it, but don't worry your pretty little head about how it is that we're going to distribute things. We're just going to make sure that there is food available. And movements like La Via Campesina, we have many representatives of La Via Campesina today, said, well, look, no, actually, power matters. This idea of food security and don't worry your pretty little head, you can be food secure in prison. But food security, if we're talking about the food system, surely we need to talk about democracy. We need to talk about power. We need to talk about the right to have a discussion about the food system. And that's why this discussion of food sovereignty is so important. It moves us away from thinking about the end product of just the grain. And it moves us to thinking about how do we make sure that relations of power are such that we get the grain into the bellies of the people who need it in a way that is democratic, that is not about being in prison and waiting for your handout, but rather in which we can participate equally. And so let me just end with suggesting that the opposite of this picture of the modern food system, is this. This is a painting by Jean-François Millet. It was painted in 1857. And it caused a riot when it first came out because it showed not the landowner. You can see the landowner over there on the far right on a horse. But what's shown here is the dignity of women at work. And I'm not being hyperbolic here and saying that this is the opposite of of industrialized food. There's a movement. There was a movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Italy called the Mondine. These were women who were weeders of rice. And they organized politically, and they were radical socialists and communists who fought for their rights in the fields. And they did it so effectively that they were among the bastions of fighters against fascism when fascism came around as it has again. They were the people who, for people who know, invented the song Bella Ciao. And their organizing has been so powerful that even after their organizing and their jobs disappeared, you can tell where they used to be. Because in Italy now, the areas where the Mondine organized are areas that still have more women in politics, have had greater militancy against the repeal of divorce, and have more nursery schools than areas that didn't have this militant peasant organizing. So let me stop there, but just remind you, to thank you for your time, and to remind you that actually we can undo the plow. But to undo the plow means recognizing the relationships of power that hide behind this idea of the Green Revolution. And that the way we undo the plow is through the kinds of militancy that have been led by peasant movements, members of which we are lucky enough to have with us today. And it's a real honor to be with you and with them. So thanks so much for your time.